But we'll ask our guest who's joining us now from Nicosia, Assel Tutumlu, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Near East University. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you.
Yeah, as the G7 leaders are meeting in Hiroshima, the five former Soviet republics, including Kazakhstan, your native Kazakhstan, are meeting in the ancient Chinese city of Xi'an, which is one of the old starting points of the Silk Roads. And it's interesting to hear China's president hailing a new era. It's a new era, but is it the end of an era for Russia? These, again, are former Soviet states.
Well, that's what the majority of experts are actually reading in it. But judging from the agreements and also judging from everything that has been signed and taught, so far, Central Asia is firmly, I think, providing the multilateral foreign policy for its population and for its own survival, particularly because they've just recently been in Moscow together with the president of Armenia, in addition to Central Asian states.
There were seven former Soviet republics represented at the Victory Day commemorations on Red Square.
Yes, together with President Lukashenko as well of Belarus, where they've actually had very nice celebration as well, a lot of informal talks, and now it's basically planned visit. All of the presidents, I think, are coming with the state or working visits to China to sign several agreements. And so far, what the media has shown is that even though China Central Asia for China represents only 1.1% of total trade. For Central Asia, China is a very sizable partner. And Kazakhstan alone, for example, signed 47 different agreements worth $22 billion. And we can say the same thing about Uzbekistan with $25 billion. So these particular cooperation agreements do not necessarily mean that Central Asia is actually moving towards China. It just basically means that they're finding adequate and very and much stronger cooperation, taking into consideration the context with the war in Ukraine and the need to actually diversify their export potential, the routes, and the trading outputs.
So it's interesting when we called up, and we just did it a moment ago, that map showing the five Central Asian nations that are represented at this summit. Of course, some like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, in fact, most of them don't even share a common border with Russia. How do they feel when they look at the weakening of the economic might of Russia and the strengthening of China's?
This actually has been very much visible in the recent winter with the energy crisis, where Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan faced huge natural gas deficits, and they couldn't even heat up the provide proper heating to the population. And afterwards, Russia actually offered both countries to have some kind of gas union. And in addition to that, have cooperation with the pipeline to ship Russian gas through Kazakhstan to China. So these things are still in talks, and they're very much interested in establishing some kind of cooperation agreement. So Russia still remains a sizable partner, even though it may not necessarily have adequate strong financial capabilities as China has, for example. But when on the very rainy days, Russia does offer something in return. May not necessarily the particular offer may not necessarily come in a kind of a free pro bono basis, but will have certain conditions attached to it. But nonetheless, for Central Asian states, this remains important.
Well, let me ask you about this then, because you have again, we saw those images a moment ago of the Kazakh president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev in the company of Xi Jinping. He was also in Moscow. He was one of those who was in Moscow back on May the 9th. But the president of Kazakhstan has distanced himself from Vladimir Putin's campaign in Ukraine. Is it a case of having to choose between China or Russia as the superpower, the go-to superpower?
I don't think that there is actually a choice. I think the government of Kazakhstan and other Central Asian states, they do not necessarily see themselves as fields. They see themselves as actors, and they're actively trying to diversify and maximize their national interests. And as a result of that, they can cooperate with Russia, they can cooperate with China, with Turkey, for that matter. And it's what happens, or what basically rules their foreign policy, is very much an idea that Central Asian states do need alternative routes. They do need alternative markets. And therefore, they're very much interested in finding them and actively pushing them through, with no matter who actually comes their way, be it Turkey, China, or for that matter, cooperation with Russia.
If I could just ask a question, it's Robert Parsons talking, France 24's chief foreign editor. Obviously Russia remains for the Central Asian states a very important player. It's a very big country, with a massive economy, and there's a relationship that has existed between the Central Asian states and Russia, before that the Soviet Union, before that the Russian Empire, which has lasted about 150 years. But it's what we're really talking about, isn't it, is the winds of change. And we're seeing a gradual shift in the focus of the Central Asian states away from Russia towards Peking. That I think is the question, isn't it, at the moment? We're seeing something happening. Obviously, they're not suddenly going to shift to Beijing from Moscow. There are lots of people from Central Asia who go to work in Russian cities, and there are ties that remain there. But there's no doubt, isn't it true, that as things change, the shift in the balance is moving towards China?
I actually don't necessarily think this way, and here's the reason why. Because if you think in 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative was actually announced, there was a kind of an understanding that Russia is very much sensitive to military concerns, security concerns in Central Asia, but not so much to retain economic prowess, so to say. Whereas China, on the contrary, was occupying the places that were not necessarily as sensitive to China in Central Asian politics by cooperating economically. And when the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced, we've seen very similar results and proposals. So we have seen, for example, policies that have pledged a lot of different infrastructure projects. They have pledged gas pipelines, and they have been implemented. And so now we have this particular summit just basically shows that we are moving to the next step of cooperation, or next stage of cooperation, where similarly we see a lot of economic pledges and a lot of economic investments that will come up. But on top of that, for example, different security concerns were also on the agenda. So, for example, one of the agreements that have featured pretty much in every single bilateral meeting today and yesterday was about exchange of information and about exchange of people who have taken citizenship, and the basic agreement that the people who received citizenship, for example, from China, and particularly, obviously, the of Turkic origin, illegally in Kazakhstan or any other Central Asian states, should actually be reprimanded, and that particular information should then be exchanged with China. So these particular things show to us that the agenda actually hasn't changed much since the 2000s. China has been just simply steadily building through the existential, so to say, infrastructural economic links with Central Asia without necessarily threading into the what many people may think of the ability to push through, for example, and have the capacity to change regimes or intervene into the domestic politics.
But if I could just throw another question to you, I mean, I accept what you're saying, but aren't we really talking about yet? I mean, that's the question. That's the situation today. What's the situation going to be like in 10 years from now? Russia is weakening economically vis-a-vis China. China is becoming gradually more involved in Central Asia. Militarily, too, China is quite expansive at the moment, an expansive mood, and regards Central Asia as part of its traditional territory. Wouldn't it be natural for China to think, well, we're moving in economically now, our political influence there will grow gradually, and militarily too, before very long?
That doesn't mean that necessarily Russia will be completely sidelined. I think there is an understanding that having cooperation with Russia in the region is actually much better for China as well. And obviously, Russia may not. In the long run, there are many different scenarios of what will happen to Russia. But as a weakened partner, nonetheless, at this point, I think it will be very important for China to cooperate with Russia, particularly, again, because
in the near future,
the economic interests.
In the near future, China and Russia will be on the same side. Just very briefly before we go, Assel Tutumlu, your reaction, this story out of Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, and a sentence of 10 years in jail for a 32-year-old man who went and fought with the Wagner mercenaries in Ukraine.
Yes, that has been it's a showcase, basically, that Central Asian regimes and governments in charge use in order not to implicate their citizens in the war. And the domestic rhetoric has actually been very strong, saying that this is not our war. And therefore, people who join the war and end up on different barricades, be it in Ukraine or in Russia, will face charges. This way, this particular decision assists the governments of Central Asia to retain neutrality and to actually safeguard their place, relatively neutral place in this conflict.
Assel Tutumlu, thank you so much for joining us from Nicosia.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we want to thank as well Robert Parsons for being with us, our international affairs editor.